If you are watching this the very moment this video is live on YouTube, then it is 4:15 p.m. August 5th, 2020 here in California. Across the Pacific Ocean in Hiroshima, Japan, it is 8:15 a.m. August 6th, 2020. 75 years to the day and time that the Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb dubbed Little Boy onto Hiroshima. Of the tens of thousands who immediately died from the blast, and the tens of thousands more who would die from the lingering effects of radiation, untreated illness, starvation, or exposure, a boy would survive with his mother, the other members of his family having been killed. He was 6 at the time. The boy would grow up, and in 1961 he would move to Tokyo to become a cartoonist and writer. He would go on to contribute to several manga anthologies, such as Shonen King and Shonen Gaho. But after his mother's death in 1966, the man would feel compelled to share what he saw on that fateful day, and the profound impact it would have on his life. First in a series of fictionalized comic books called Struck by Black Rain. Then, in 1972, the man would put to paper his actual lived biographical experience in the simply titled I Saw It. His then editor convinced him to expand the story into an actual manga series, so in 1973 publication began on the man's new manga, and would continue jumping from magazine to magazine until the series finally ended in 1987. Removed from the man's life, the manga series would spill over from the days leading up to the bombing and into the subsequent years afterward, often casting a critical eye on Japanese militarization and the glorification found in its society, as well as the abuse often found in the traditional family dynamic. The story would be retold again and again in several adaptations. There would be a trilogy of live-action films released from 1976 to 1980, as well as a live-action TV drama released in 2007, as well as 2 anime films created by Studio Madhouse, released in 1983 and 1986. The manga would prove to be the man's life work, and he dedicated himself and its story to nuclear disarmament. But in 2009, citing poor health issues, he would retire from the public life, canceling his proposed sequel. In 2010, he was diagnosed with lung cancer, and by 2011, it had metastasized. The man's name was Keiji Nakazawa, and he would die on December 19th, 2012, at age 73. In honor of his life, Anime Abandoned is proud to present the anime adaptations of his magnum opus, Barefoot Gen. In the waning days of World War II, after the European Axis powers had surrendered to the Allied forces, Japan was losing the war hand over fist. Despite being devastated by the continual firebombing by American forces, and despite having their allies surrendering, the Japanese army refused to submit, leaning on its people's unwavering patriotism, even if it meant all necessities being rationed to the point of near starvation. Honor for the emperor and his army are held above all. But dissent is found in Daikichi Nakaoka, a family man and sandal maker in Hiroshima. He burdens himself with shame for not towing the patriotic line, but teaches his young sons, Gen and Shinji, that while hardship is inevitable, there is honor in perseverance, like the wheat that grows in winter. Gen and Shinji, too young to fully understand the precarious moment in history they live in, can only laugh off their father's stories. But they are not so ignorant that they don't know that food is scarce, and their expecting mother needs to eat. Their days are spent thinking of childish, fanciful ideas of how they can feed their mother, which the film uses as a stark contrast of their increasingly desperate situation. It never occurs to either Shinji or Gen to be sad that they have to entertain the idea of feeding their mother caterpillars in the first place. They just know that their mother needs food by any means, even if they had to steal fish from a neighbor's koi pond to do it. The film, in turn, uses these scenes as a sort of sword of Damocles, as the characters are not privy to their fate, but we, the audience, are. While their family drama plays out before us, they find short moments of solace in human kindness, all backed with cheery music and affirmations that if they just stand up straight and grit their teeth and push on through, they can survive anything, and a happy ending will find them. Meanwhile, the audience can only interpret these scenes as bittersweet, if not utterly surreal. The tone feels intentionally saccharine, exaggerated even, as if these moments of respite and comfort are to be memories of days long gone. The film only tips its hand with a single moment, as Daikichi openly wonders why Hiroshima, despite the cyclical air raid sirens and the constant bombings all over Japan, remains unscathed from aerial attack. 周りの都市はみんなやられとるに、なんで広島の町は攻撃されんのじゃろう? Considering the subject matter, the film and story are wise to ease the audience into this false sense of security. Yes, we know all too well what lies ahead for these characters, but without a sense of their life and how they make sense of it, we wouldn't be able to appreciate their philosophy when unimaginable cruelty falls upon them, as the clock finally strikes 8:15. In all my years of watching anime, I have never seen a moment so utterly terrifying and captured so bravely than here in Barefoot Gen. It is unflinching in its portrayal of brutality and sorrow, as children, adults, old men, and parents are consumed by atomic fire, completely helpless to thwart their fate. The color palette shifts to unnatural, sickly hues, and the sound mixing is deafeningly loud, as wild winds roar through the streets of Hiroshima, all before culminating in one final burst, a towering mushroom cloud that hovers over the city. If for no other reason, Barefoot Gen is laudable for capturing the sheer horror of that day. But what elevates the film further is its mindfulness that the true test of the human spirit in Gen has yet to come. Lucky enough to be behind a stone wall as the blast hit, Gen survives long enough to find his mother attempting to dislodge the rest of the family from under the burning wreck of their house. The two are sadly incapable, leaving only enough time for Gen's father to say their goodbyes. At 6 years old, Gen is now responsible for himself and his mother, who goes into labor mere moments after losing nearly her entire family. Another return to mixing sweet with the bitter, as a life is born on a day of so much death. お前のお父ちゃんとお姉ちゃんとお兄ちゃんを殺した戦争の姿、よう見とくんよ。From here, the midpoint of the film, and carried through to its 1986 sequel in its entirety, Barefoot Gen begins chronicling the everyday life of trying to survive after August 6th, or even trying to make sense of it all. Beyond the flash of the bomb, death lingers in the black rain that falls from the clouds, contaminating the ground and poisoning what precious few water resources are left. Death is found even in the living, as those that weren't fortunate enough to be immediately killed are left shambling to any source of water they could find with their skin hanging from their body like rags. And yet, even in the face of so much terror, Gen can only keep his promise to his dad, resolving to take care of himself and his mother, as well as his new sister, Tomoko. Because the film and its sequel are more focused on the day-to-day lives of the characters, they both forego a traditional narrative of a ramping action that drives the plot forward. Instead, by focusing on the minutiae and the seemingly never-ending grind of getting through yet another day, Barefoot Gen shows just how much it takes to survive for all those years after the bomb fell. Tragedies become commonplace, plans of action fail, fear lives with you on a constant basis, and nothing is for certain except the promise of another day. The struggle they feel becomes ours to bear. この頃、お母ちゃんの体も調子が良さそうじゃし、きっとええ年になるわい。再来年はどうかの？再来年はもっとええ年になるんじゃ。While I find both films, Barefoot Gen in particular, to be exemplary as war films, and as films in general, they are not without the occasional clunky moment. While the choice to tell its story in a fragmented day-to-day succession is thematically appropriate, It's also symptomatic to the serialized nature of the manga. Between a manga's pages, a character can shift between sorrow and newfound hope in the span of a panel, and the reader wouldn't so much as shrug because the reader decides the pace by which the story is told. However, in a film, the story can only tell itself by one pace dictated by itself, so this exact shift can be off-putting if the film needs to tell itself in under an hour and a half, and this sadly happens numerous times between both films.
わしゃ迷惑かける気構わん方がいいぞ。
何を言うるんや。このままほっとけるかんや。
すまんの。
水を飲みたいぞ、ハゲタカ。
じゃあ。
拾え、ハゲタカ。
わいらだけじゃ真剣にわしに向こうで来てくれたんは嬉しかったんじゃ。
For what are otherwise insistent films that aim to portray the sorrow and plight of the people that survived the bomb as accurately and as viscerally uncompromising as possible, these moments ring hollow to the viewer. Likewise, the story of the Nakaoka family often repeats itself through the two films, sometimes beat for beat. I won't go into specifics for the sake of not wanting to go into spoilers, but it is unmissable. Not to mention, there are a myriad of setup and payoff issues that feel like they were the victims of the cutting room floor, just as several characters are also missing from the manga. Lastly, it also feels that the sequel suffers from a misplaced sense of focus, leaving a lot of characters' development and what they contribute in the telling of the story feeling artificially abbreviated.
Yay! お化けお化けお化けが来たで Yay! Yay!
But I feel it's fair to say that Barefoot Gen is almost a mandatory watch, not just from an anime perspective, as few films portraying important moments in history have been able to capture the raw intensity of not only nuclear war, but the all too often forgotten aftermath. And, at the end of the day, that is what these films are about. Not letting the present forget the past. What you see here is the Hiroshima Peace Memorial. When it was built in 1915, it was called the Hiroshima Prefectural Commercial Exhibition Hall, and was mainly used to exhibit art and for other educational purposes. Located near the epicenter of the blast, barely a stone's throw away from the intended target, the Iowa Bridge, it stands today in ruins as a memorial for the over 140,000 people who had died, becoming a World Heritage Site sanctioned by the UN. I visited this place back in November of 2019. Nearby the memorial, there is a park and museum where visitors can access first-hand accounts and relics of the devastation. I didn't take any video of the museum for obvious reasons, but I took back with me a number of brochures and leaflets in differing languages. One of them is this catalog of art hung in the museum, all by survivors of the blast. The art itself is fairly rudimentary. None of the artists here are professionals by trade, but they all felt compelled to share what they saw. I won't show what's inside this brochure because of its, frankly, graphic depictions, but if you feel compelled to see them anyway, most of them are available online, and I'll have a link in the description box. I remember my time milling around the park and museum feeling a bit like I was walking on hallowed ground. Everything felt familiar and safe, and I was welcomed as a visitor as warmly as anyone else could be, but I couldn't shake the creeping feeling that I shouldn't be there. I, as well as my friend Gavin, were the only Americans there on that day, as far as we could tell, and that fact weighed heavy on us as we toured through the exhibits. Along the darkly lit corridors, between mangled bits of concrete that were once homes or stores, soldiers' helmets and clothing, as well as bits and pieces of candy tins recovered from the rubble and even actual human remains, I would hear in one ear the prepared audio cues in British English, detailing what these objects were in relation to what life was like before and after. But in the other ear, I would hear the laughter of children. Not some echo of ghosts past, but actual flesh and blood children. It had seemed on that day a nearby school had a field trip planned for its student body, and the children, who had probably heard all the stories before, went along the trip in their presumably usual rambunctious way. They would chatter, laugh, play on their phones, and be otherwise oblivious to the horror that was on display. And if some of them were to catch our eyes, they would excitedly come up to either me or Gavin and try their English out on us. Their attempts to say hello and cool were much-needed bits of levity. As we left the main exhibit, we made our way to the guest book, where patrons left their thoughts for others to read. Gavin was able to articulate the surreal nature of the experience far better than I was, writing for minutes on end about the duality of carnage and ignorant joy. All I was able to muster was a single word: sobering. To this day, I don't feel like they were intentionally being disruptive to be little jerks, but that they were processing these relics and stories the only way they knew how, by either ignoring it or joking about it. It's the prerogative of children to not understand or appreciate the gravitas of their surroundings. Afterward, Gavin and I made our way to Shukeien Garden, a small tea garden situated a few kilometers northeast of the museum. The name Shukeien, roughly translated, means something close to Shrunken Scenery Garden. The name fits it perfectly. From this secluded patch of forest, you can see the Enko River, one of the major tributaries that form the delta that Hiroshima was built on. It was an otherworldly experience, exactly as peaceful and quiet as we had hoped it would be. My memory has it as a perfect moment, a time and place where I felt completely attuned to the environment. And yet, even here, the atomic shadow that Hiroshima casts is found in a small memorial, often festooned with paper cranes, a symbol of peace, and bottles of water, comfort for those that had cried out for water after the bomb fell. It's here that I find Hiroshima's relationship with its past at its most palpable. In the museum and park, the epicenter of the blast has been turned into a living memorial for those that perished. But it itself is not the entirety of Hiroshima or its history. No one place can be. In Shukeien, a garden that was first built in 1620, over 3 centuries before World War II even began, you see Hiroshima's history beyond the blast. Fitting as it is a miracle that it survived at all being so close to ground zero, albeit not without needing renovations. And yet, it cannot help but be where it is. And it cannot help but remember those that need to be remembered. It's as complete a portrait of Hiroshima as one place can be. When I filmed this footage, intending to use it in this review, I hadn't figured out how I would actually do it. And eventually I just resigned myself to wait until the anniversary was closer to figure that part out. And then 2020 happened. Trying to remember life back in November of 2019 sometimes feels like trying to remember your own birth. But when I do manage to put myself back those 10 months ago, my thoughts keep tracing themselves back to those kids in the museum and the lovely hour we spent in the garden. I think about how those children had the ability to be so blissfully unaware, as how could they relate to something that happened 75 years ago? Odds are that some of their grandparents weren't even alive yet to remember it. And then I wonder how they feel about the times they live in now. And then I think about how this time will be remembered. This truly, truly awful year that just doesn't seem to end. But then I think about that garden, so far and yet so near to the blast, and how even a small memorial tucked away in a thicket could still draw those that want to leave their honors and tidings. And I think about how in 75 years, when people will look back on this time of chaos and violence and hating each other and death, will they leave anything for some memorial that might exist? Will it be placed in a part of the world that is tranquil and calm? Will children roll their eyes and sink into their phones, comforted by the ignorance of never having to live in such a time when they visit it? I really, really hope so. If there's anything to take away from Barefoot Gen, it's that if you can move, you can move forward. Summer Wars. Till next time.